There were three of us in that room and a half of ours, my father, my mother, and I. A family, a typical Russian family of the time. The time was after the war, and very few people could afford more than one child. Some of them couldn't even afford to have the father alive or present. Great terror and war took their toll in big cities, and my hometown especially. So we should have considered ourselves lucky, especially since we were Jews. All three of us survived the war, and I say all three because I too was born before it, in 1940. My parents, however, survived the 30s also. Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Please support this channel and discover new literature by getting your copy of Commuting. You can link to it in the description. You can also link to the Gymnasia Press website, where you can get the short story collection Comorbidities and the novel Non-Local. The excerpt I was reading comes from Joseph Brodsky's essay, his long essay, In a Room and a Half. This is the essay that ends this collection. It's about 50 pages. It's written in the same style of many of his other essays, this fragmentary style. This focuses on his past life, his memories. This essay is a bit sad in that it's sort of a memorial to his parents. He's writing about the home that they grew up in. It's a communal apartment. So every family gets a room and a half. So these big apartments that were divided up where several families are living in them. He talks about the fact that he was kind of lucky. They actually had a fairly small one compared to other apartments in the city. Not so many people living together, and not so many people informing on each other, but they did have to share the kitchen. They had to share a bathroom. He talks about, some of the unpleasant things about recognizing people by the sounds of their farts or knowing their underwear. But he also talks sort of happily about these, or fondly about these unpleasant and even embarrassing moments of living together. An important part of this essay, this is chapter 10, he focuses on the fact that he's writing in English and why he decided to write this essay in English, but really I think all of his essays are written in English as opposed to his poetry, which he wrote in Russian. And he says here, I write this in English because I want to grant them, his parents, a margin of freedom, the margin whose width depends on the number of those who may be willing to read this. I want Maria Volpert and Alexander Brodsky to acquire reality under a foreign code of conscience. I want English verbs of motion to describe their movements. This won't resurrect them, but English grammar may at least prove to be a better escape route from the chimneys of the state crematorium than the Russian. To write about them in Russian would be only to further their captivity, their reduction to insignificance resulting in mechanical annihilation. I know that one shouldn't equate the state with language, but it was in Russian that two old people shuffling through numerous state chancelleries and ministries in the hope of obtaining a permit to go abroad for a visit to see their only son before they died were told repeatedly for 12 years in a row that the state considers such a visit unpurposeful. So this is probably where Brodsky is at his bitterest. He's angry at that his parents have died, and for 12 years they've tried to go and visit him and they couldn't. And partly this is what is motivating him to write in English. He feels like by doing this, he's given them some afterlife, some freedom of breaking away from Russian culture and the Russian language. That's not to disparage the language. He does in other parts, in other essays, he talks very very nicely about the language. He was fond of the Russian language. He respected the Russian language. But in this section here, he's seeing this as a chance, by writing in English, as a chance to give his parents some freedom. And then he says later, same chapter, "May English then house my dead. In Russian, I am prepared to read, write verses or letters. For Maria Volpert and Alexander Brodsky, though, English offers a better semblance of afterlife, maybe the only one there is, save my very self. And as far as the latter is concerned, writing this in the language is like doing those dishes. It's therapeutic." So the therapeutic aspect of washing dishes is a reference just a little earlier in the essay, something he discussed with his mother. The idea that an afterlife, this is the only afterlife he can give them besides himself. This is another theme that comes up throughout not just this essay, but other Brodsky work, this idea that the children are kind of the afterlife of the parents. They I think, where's this section? There was one here. He talks about the fact that they kind of progress through their parents. So this is a perspective that he brings in as he's remembering his parents and reflecting on his childhood. Developing the theme of childhood and adulthood, because that's also kind of central to this essay. In chapter 18, he says, "To a varying degree, every child craves adulthood and yearns to get out of his house, out of his oppressive nest, out into real life, into the wide world, into life on his own terms." So he's speaking of himself, living in this room and a half where they had very little privacy. Other parts of the novel or this essay, he talks about building kind of structures that acted as barriers so his parents couldn't see the kind of things he's doing. So it's this oppressive nest, but then after you get out, it says, "Then one day when the new reality is mastered, your own life that you've set up, when his own terms are implemented, he suddenly learns that his old nest is gone and that those who gave him life are dead. On that day, he feels like an effect suddenly without its cause." So that would be the child without the parents, an effect without its cause. "The enormity of the loss makes it incomprehensible. His mind, made naked by this loss, shrinks and increases the magnitude of the loss even further. He realizes that his youthful quest for real life, his departure from the nest, have rendered that nest defenseless. This is bad enough. Still, he can put the blame on nature. So the fact that he's left has made his house, his nest, kind of vulnerable, his parents vulnerable. He's not there to protect them. And he says, okay, this is just nature. But there's another aspect of this that makes it bad. What he can't blame on nature is the discovery that his achievement, the reality of his own manufacture, is less valid than the reality of his abandoned nest. That if there ever was anything real in his life, it was precisely that nest, oppressive and suffocating, from which he so badly wanted to flee, because it was built by others, by those who gave him life, and not by him, who knows only too well the true worth of his own labor, who, as it were, just uses the given life. So in adulthood, it's disappointing. You realize that actually it was the childhood life, the life you had in that home, even though you wanted to flee and get out of that, you felt oppressed and suffocated, that was the only real existence, because this new reality that you've created doesn't live up to it. As he says here, you know the true worth of your own labor, so he's kind of belittling his own labor, or at least he's unsatisfied with that. This also captures Brodsky's view in general. These are all memoirs. He's looking at the past. He's nostalgic. He sees the past as being better than the present, better than the future, even when he is criticizing the lifestyle that he had in Russia. It's somehow more real than what he has now. And what comes across in this essay is there's definitely a connection, a clear, he had a good childhood, even though he had these problems. He was living in this city where he felt oppressed. He had a good childhood. He cared for his parents, and he sees this separation between his parents as a great loss, a great violation. And that's, in large part, I think, what this essay captures through its 45 chapters, kind of fragmented view of his life with them and his anger, his bitterness of being separated from them. Near the end, he talks about DNA and this idea of, he talked earlier about children being kind of a progress of their parents, and this is brought together with the idea of genes. So he says here, "For I am grateful to my mother and my father, not only for giving me life, but also for failing to bring up their child as a slave. They tried the best they could, if only to safeguard me against the social reality I was born into, to turn me into the state's obedient, loyal member." So his parents tried to make him into this obedient member of the Russian state, even if they just did that just to try to protect him so he didn't have other heartaches. That they didn't succeed, that they had to pay for it with their eyes being closed, not by their son, but by the anonymous hand of the state, testifies not to their laxness, but to the quality of their genes, whose fusion produced a body the system found alien enough to eject. Come to think of it, what else could be expected from the combined strength of his and her ability to endure? So he sees the fact that his parents were so strong to endure this lifestyle and the war that, of course, they're going to produce a child that will not become a slave within the system, but will be, as he said, ejected by the system as he was, eventually kicked out of Russia, had his passport revoked. And so he sees this as a carrying on of their genes, and that they produce this being that could not live within this system. Obviously, this is not science, but this is the job, I think, of the poet, the job of the memoirist, the writer, to try to bring some poetry to the kind of cold view of science. And that's partly what he's doing here by invoking the language of science, even though it's not science itself, and I'm sure many biologists would call it pseudoscience to speak in this way. Finally, the end. He often ends his essays with kind of curious little stories that we don't really know what to make of them. Or they can be interpreted multiple ways, ambiguous. So the end here, he remembers being at this summer garden with his father. His father's taken some photos. And he says here, "Staring at the brass band, I found myself asking him," his father, "which concentration camps in his view were worse, the Nazis or ours? As for myself," came the reply, "I'd rather be burned at the stake at once than die a slow death and discover a meaning in the process." Then he proceeded to snap pictures. So we don't get a lot of his father in this story, at least not dialogue. So this is obviously important. It stands out, and it's a pretty bleak line of dialogue. He's saying, I would rather just die painfully very quickly than have this long life that's painful, yet I discover meaning in it. Yet right after that, he's snapping photos, which seems to be him trying to find meaning in this. He seems to have a fairly long life, and so did Brodsky, though Brodsky got out. So is this a comment on the fact that the parents were were in a concentration camp, an open-air concentration camp. Perhaps that's too hyperbolic to describe life that way. Again, it's curious. I don't know fully what to make of this, but the father seems to be offering his advice on what the son might think about doing, to go for the swift pain instead of the long drawn out process. And maybe that's also why the son left. He wanted to risk having the quick, painful death. So the essay it's a bit of a downer. It's a bleak essay. At the same time, it's, I think, emotionally moving. It's clear that Brodsky, this is kind of a love letter for his parents. He's really connecting with them, their memory, and trying to recreate it like an afterlife, just like as he talks about in the English language.